On September 11, 2001, 19 terrorists with the terrorist group Al-Qaeda carried out a suicide mission to attack America by hijacking commercial airlines and flying them into the World Trade Center buildings in New York City and the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. A fourth plane was taken down in a field in Pennsylvania by heroes on board that had taken the plane over from the terrorists. At approximately 8:45 a.m., an American Airlines flight crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City. The explosion left a huge hole in the side of the building. The impact instantly killed hundreds of working Americans and trapped many more in the higher floors. At first, Americans believed that it may have been an accident, but approximately 20 minutes later, a second plane was seen flying low, and America watched the plane deliberately fly into the South Tower. We knew at that point that we were under attack, and the mood of Americans quickly turned to anger. White House Chief of Staff Andy Card is seen here whispering the news into the ear of President George W. Bush, who was reading with school children at Emma E. Booker Elementary School in Sarasota, Florida. After discussing the options with his staff, he decided to address the nation from the library at the school. The president said, "Today we have had a national tragedy. Two airplanes have crashed into the World Trade Centers in an apparent terrorist attack on our country. President Bush did his best to assure Americans that we were safe." By now, almost every American was glued to a TV, wherever they could find one, wondering what would happen next. News stations were airing the terror on every channel, from first responders attempting to rescue people to Americans running for their lives in obvious panic and terror. As the events were unfolding in New York City, reports came across the screen that a plane had struck the Pentagon in Washington, D.C. The plane had flown into the west side of the military headquarters and led to the collapse of a portion of the building. As the news reports quickly switched to the Pentagon, Americans were terrified. The attack at the Pentagon killed 125 Americans in the Pentagon and 64 people aboard the airliner. Less than 15 minutes after the attacks on the Pentagon, with millions of Americans still watching on TV around the country, it happened. The World Trade Center South Tower collapsed in front of our eyes into a massive cloud of dust and smoke, killing hundreds of Americans. Shortly after, at approximately 10:30 a.m., the North Tower of the World Trade Center collapsed. Close to 3,000 people died in New York City that day, including 343 firefighters and paramedics, 23 New York City police officers, and 37 Port Authority police officers who were attempting an evacuation of the trapped victims. Only 6 people who were in the towers at the time of their collapse survived the attack. Almost 10,000 others were treated for injuries. Many of them were severe. Two symbols of American pride, two of America's tallest buildings, were gone before the eyes of millions of Americans, and with them thousands of innocent victims. Left in their places was a burial ground, a crime scene, a war zone. This site would become known as Ground Zero. The collapse of the towers left huge holes in the ground. A memorial was later constructed in their place as a reminder of the worst day America had seen since Pearl Harbor. Meanwhile, a fourth plane, United Flight 93, was hijacked by the last 4 terrorists. The flight had been delayed, and the passengers had learned of the prior attacks via conversations with friends and family by cell phone before the plane had taken off. Once the plane had been taken over by terrorists, the passengers knew that they needed to do something. Many of the passengers were planning an attack on the hijackers to take the plane back over. The passengers fought the 4 hijackers and are thought to have attacked the cockpit with a fire extinguisher. By the time the passengers could gain control back of the plane, it was too late. The terrorist is thought to have put the plane in a nosedive because he could see that the passengers were taking the plane back over. At 10:10 a.m., the plane crashed into a field in Shanksville, Pennsylvania at 500 miles per hour, causing a massive explosion and a gaping black hole. All 45 people aboard were killed in the crash. The passengers aboard the plane will forever be known as heroes for their selfless acts of bravery. The intended target is not known, but theories included the White House and the U.S. Capitol. First responders were just beginning rescues that would last through countless days and nights. The fire at Ground Zero would burn for another 3 months. But already by morning, a new reality had set in. America had just experienced its darkest day. Americans started to gather around Ground Zero with feelings of sadness and disbelief. Americans began to realize the destruction and the casualties that the attacks had left behind. Americans had lost their loved ones. Parents had lost their children. Women had lost their husbands. Husbands had lost their wives, and children had lost their parents. The feeling of anger was quickly overtaken by deep sadness. Firemen watched in disbelief as there was nothing that they could do. They felt helpless, and they were. The New York City first responders were named heroes for their acts of bravery. Acts of patriotism was shown over the next several weeks, from Little League sporting events all the way to the majors, and in many ways across the nation. America came together as one to show that we are united, we are America, and we are one. Bin Laden, who planned the attacks, initially denied but later admitted involvement. Al Jazeera broadcast a statement by Bin Laden on September 16, 2001 stating, "I stress that I have not carried out this act, which appears to have been carried out by individuals with their own motivation." Shortly before the U.S. presidential election in 2004, in a taped statement, Bin Laden publicly acknowledged al-Qaeda's involvement in the attacks on the U.S. and admitted his direct link to the attacks. He said that the attacks were carried out because we are free and we want to regain freedom for our nation. Osama bin Laden's declaration of a holy war against the United States was al-Qaeda's three motives for its activities against Western countries: the presence of U.S. troops in Saudi Arabia, U.S. support of Israel, and sanctions against Iraq. After a nearly 10-year manhunt, bin Laden was killed by American Special Forces SEAL Team 6 in a compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan on May 2, 2011. That evening, President Barack Obama addressed the nation to confirm the reports of the death of bin Laden. The attacks resulted in the death of 2,996 people, including the 19 hijackers and 2,977 victims. The victims included 246 on the 4 planes, from which there were no survivors, 2,606 in New York City in the towers and on the ground, and 125 at the Pentagon. Nearly all of the victims were civilians. 55 military personnel were among those killed at the Pentagon. Cleanup of the World Trade Center site was completed in May 2002, and the Pentagon was repaired within a year. Numerous memorials have been constructed, including the National September 11th Memorial and Museum in New York City, the Pentagon Memorial in Washington, D.C., and the Flight 93 National Memorial in Pennsylvania. After a lengthy delay, the 1,776-foot-tall One World Trade Center is expected to be completed at Ground Zero in New York City in 2013. 3 additional World Trade Centers are expected to soon follow. America has survived, we have rebuilt, and we have united, and we will never forget September 11, 2001.